Hey, Wayne? Wayne? Would you like this thing on?
I said, what did you find?
Technology.
Yeah, right.
It's sharp this morning.
Thanks, my friend. We need a 12-year-old in here. Chris Segers, very nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. It's my pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you.
I don't know.
Okay. Today, it's my, okay. Perhaps you saw the brochure, but this is a topic that's pretty near and dear to me. That is, can monopolies be positive for consumers? On the one hand, where would we be without the technological innovations of Microsoft, or for those people who are really cool, Apple? And what about Google, which has collected or striven to save and share every piece of information and publication ever written by mankind? Today we're dominated by a handful of corporations which really cover the planet. I don't want to give our speaker any ideas, but it seems that these, to me, are robber barons on steroids. Over 50% of all commerce is e-commerce. It's online. We're dominated by companies such as Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Google, Facebook, and they collect information for the purpose. Professor Segers can elaborate more, but there are people who want to use this information. There are people who believe it can swing elections. Is this all good? We are fortunate today to have Professor Chris Segers, the James Thomas Distinguished Professor of Law at Cleveland State University. He's a nationally recognized expert on American competition policy. He's testified before the U.S. Congress and the Antitrust Modernization Commission. He's author of United States versus Apple, the e-books case, and the intellectual history of competition as a public policy. He has appeared in many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, CNBC, Fox News, and National Public Radio. He frequently participates in important antitrust litigation by consulting with plaintiffs and enforcement officials pro bono and authorizing briefs, amicus curiae, in federal courts of appeals. I could go on, but I wouldn't give him enough time that he deserves. Professor Segers, thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. So people can hear me. Okay. Very good. Thanks very much for having me. This is really a privilege on several levels, partly because this is a topic I love talking about, but also because this is my first experience ever with this particular faith, and it sort of confirmed. I looked at your 6 sources and 7 principles this morning, and confirms the sense that I had that if I were going to join a formal denomination, it probably would be this one. And I've received a very warm welcome this morning, so thank you very much. I'm Chris Segers. I've taught antitrust law at Cleveland State University for about 15 years. Susan and Jonathan asked me today to talk about, to quote the title, Antitrust Competition in the Future, which are pretty big ideas, I guess, but I have a topic to talk about that I hope actually addresses those big ideas pretty well. I'd like to say first that, I was happy with the sort of written blurb describing the topic in Jonathan's warm introduction as provocative, but let me clarify one thing right up front, which is that I'm not here to make an argument that monopolies are good or anything like that. In fact, I think they're pretty bad. And in particular, we're in an interesting point in our history with respect to big firms and the capitalism that sort of sometimes gives them purchase. What I am going to talk about is one specific case, really, but I've chosen it not because the case itself is particularly interesting, but rather because it's a case study. It was a controversial, very closely watched case involves a lot of the issues that Jonathan just mentioned, and I think it captures in microcosm those bigger ideas that Susan and Jonathan asked me to talk about. And in particular, the controversy that surrounded the case captures one particular issue that I think is surely the most interesting intellectually in antitrust, and I think also important. And that is, it captures problems that have made the having of a competition policy really difficult throughout the history of the United States. We've had an antitrust law longer than any other country. We've always had a lot of trouble enforcing it. And we're in a period, yet again, when we're sort of trying to figure out what to do with it, how to feel about the companies that are subject to it, and we're disagreeing about it a lot. And that's a very interesting thing. So anyway, the case I picked to talk about is a case that I've been obsessed with for basically the 6 years since it was first initiated, and that was the famous case of United States versus Apple, which was a government antitrust case against the Apple Computer Corporation and several publishers of books. And the allegation was that they had fixed the price of electronic books. The case was sort of instantly fascinating from the day it was announced. And the thing that was so interesting about it really goes to the heart of these big issues, which was specifically this. It was a case that basically, to any antitrust lawyer, most antitrust lawyers who looked at the case, it was a case the government could lose. That is, if the government proved the facts that it alleged in its complaint. And the complaint is quite a read, because you sort of read it and you kind of can't believe that business executives would do these things and not try to conceal it at least. But anyway, it was a case that to antitrust lawyers, if the government could prove the facts they alleged, it couldn't lose. And in fact, to many antitrust lawyers, the big surprise in the case was why the government didn't prosecute criminally, because the facts alleged were the kind of facts that people go to prison over. But the thing is, that in itself wasn't interesting. In particular, we see lots of cases with brazen executive conduct. What was interesting was that to basically everybody else looking at the case, it was very troubling indeed for various different reasons. That is, most people outside the narrow, isolated little fraternity and sorority of antitrust lawyers thought the case was a lot harder than the law seemed to make it look. That was for a variety of reasons. One of the biggest reasons was, and this gets directly to the issues that Jonathan raised in his introduction, one of the biggest reasons the case was troubling was that to a lot of people, the real elephant in the room was a firm that was not party to the case, and that was Amazon. The government sued publishers and Apple for doing something that they and a lot of their supporters in the public said was actually needed or useful to protect the publishers and authors and literature itself from Amazon. Okay, so my bottom line take on all this, I'll talk about that at more length, but by way of introducing it, my basic take on the case and how I particularly choose to feel about it, how I think we all should probably think about it, is that the real problem, the real issue or interesting challenge in the case is that it's an example of a problem in the having of a competition policy, which is that we generally speaking think, as Americans, that markets in competition, free enterprise, whatever you want to call it, are pretty good. They do a good job at some things, at least by comparison to the alternatives. They have some benefits. And in particular, markets in competition have even been pretty well accepted by most Americans on the left of American opinion, because they can be a tool, at least when they're properly sort of overseen by government, for containing private power. Okay? And indeed, historically at least, Americans have sort of had like a unique commitment as a people to markets and free enterprise, sort of deeply rooted in our our history as frontiers people and entrepreneurs. Yes, sir?
I'm just looking.
Okay. So anyway, so at least in the abstract, Americans tend to have a certain affinity for the markets that are supposed to be a basic commitment of our antitrust laws. That is, if you're going to have a competition policy, it's basically a policy that says, well, firms got to compete. They can't get together and conspire. They can't try to get a monopoly. They can't acquire each other to take power over their markets. And that's, generally speaking, a good goal. The problem is, while we can all feel reasonably good about that in the abstract, some of us feel less good, especially these days, but for the most part, as a people, we've largely accepted that. The problem is, while it's relatively easy to accept in the abstract, as soon as individual cases are brought, everything seems more complicated. It turns out that pretty much every time a defendant is sued, the defendant, at least, and typically some people who are watching the case, will be able to point to certain features that seem to make that situation special in some way or another. And there's something about the market that requires some clemency from the ordinary demands of competition that we typically require of all firms. Apple was emphatically a case in that model. Okay? And the most interesting thing about it, from my humble perspective, was it was a case that found defenders. The defendants found supporters, not only in the usual quarters. Like, you can usually count on some Republicans to support any defendant in antitrust. But Apple found supporters all across the political spectrum. For obvious reasons, as we said, many people thought the real problem here is Amazon. The government has sued the wrong firm. This proves that our antitrust has taken such a wrong direction because we have a monopolist abusing its suppliers, that is Amazon, and it's getting off. Not only is it getting off scot-free, it's actually got the assistance of the Justice Department in this particular case. But the case also found supporters, the defendants found supporters on the right of political opinion, and they supported the defense for completely different reasons, obviously. It's pretty hard to find a Republican out there, although there were some, surprisingly, who are willing to say, what we really should do is sue Amazon because it's a monopolist. What the right said about the case instead was there are various reasons to expect that competition was actually problematic in this case. Apple couldn't enter the case without a price-fixing conspiracy among its suppliers to help it compete, et cetera, et cetera. But what struck me about it, enough that I'm writing a book about it, I've been spending years up in this case, what struck me about it is that while superficially these arguments between left and right about the case surely differ in their details, it turns out they actually are fairly similar in their general logic. The logic in all of those cases, all of the arguments that are made about the case are the real problem in the case was competition itself. That is, the real problem in the case is Amazon's a big firm. It figured out how to do something, which is to sell electronic books. Amazon invented that market effectively. The story's more complicated than that, but e-books didn't exist as a meaningful market until Amazon introduced the Kindle in 2007. And then Amazon afterwards was extraordinarily aggressive, as that firm is in most things that it does, and it was aggressive above all in the prices that it insisted on offering to retail consumers. Books suddenly were being sold at $10, brand new release, best-selling books at $10, even though immediately before then, those sorts of books could command $35 and more cover price. The argument from both left and right was that this low price itself was the problem, and it had to be addressed in some way for the betterment of society. So the left said, well, this is how Amazon is getting monopoly, and it's doing this in all of its sectors. It's killing off competitors because it can sell at prices that nobody can match. The right said essentially the same thing. We need competition because competition is good, say those advocates. And in order to have it, we have to have new entry. We have to have new firms enter this market and actually offer competition to Amazon. And that entry is going to take the form, many people said, of a firm like Apple, which will invent its own e-book reader or its own e-book technology and offer it. But there's no way that firm could do it except that it gets some protection from the sort of rapacious aggression of Amazon's pricing. So that seemed pretty interesting to me. People have different views about what quote-unquote competition is or what it should be. We've debated that for many years in antitrust policy. But one thing most people do agree on is that, well, you know, competition, vigorous competition tends to make prices go down. That's surely a commitment of basic microeconomics, and it's not the subject of too much controversy. And yet here we were with people all across the political spectrum saying the problem in this case is that competition itself is too vigorous. It dawned on me, you know, that actually is arguably the inner core of the arguments that we hear all the time from all kinds of antitrust defendants, that their market is special in a certain way and needs protection from vigorous competition. Competition is too vigorous in this market, and therefore we should relax antitrust rules to let these defendants do things that ordinarily defendants can't do. And it dawned on me further that, in fact, these kind of arguments are pretty common. Like, you can find arguments like this in all kinds of cases. And it turns out that in 130 years of antitrust history, there pretty much has never been an antitrust defendant that didn't think its market was special. And they always have, sometimes not so plausibly, but they always pretty much have some sort of argument to that effect, and they can find some supporters for it. And so in the earliest days of antitrust, we see important cases in which courts have to address the issue of whether a given market was special. And for example, one of the most famous cases in all of antitrust history occurs in the mid-1890s, in which a set of defendants said they needed to be able to fix prices in their market. They were horizontal competitors. They're going to set prices at minimum so that they're not really competing with each other, and they said they had to do it because otherwise they couldn't compete. Competition itself was the problem. And what was the argument in that case that the case was special? You might think, in a case like Apple, well, there's a pretty good argument that there's something special about the case, right? I mean, we're talking about a very special product, which is books. We're talking about a technological revolution, which is e-commerce and the digitization of cultural products. Well, it turns out the argument that case was special in the mid-1890s involved cast iron soil pipes. Okay, so, and there are many other examples throughout the history of antitrust in which seemingly very mundane products have been said to be so special in one way or another that the defendants had to be freed from competition. And throughout the history of the law, there have been people across the political spectrum who have found those arguments more or less persuasive. So my view on Amazon is to sort of take that head on the Apple case rather. And to take a case in which the argument for specialness was admittedly empathetic, very persuasive to me. I mean, I'm letting my cards show a little bit. I'm a lefty from way back. I love books. I love paper books. I hate Walmart. I love small town stores, right? So for all the reasons most people are troubled by Amazon, I am too. But the question in the case was, are those reasons that we ought to let the publishing firms do something that ordinarily we wouldn't let defendants do? And that is to fix a price for the products that they were selling. And so to answer that, I have sort of thought about, okay, what are the arguments? What have been the various arguments that some special clemency is required in this case? If you work through them sort of one by one, you think, that, as I have attempted to do, if you think about them sort of in increasing order of plausibility, you find, first of all, that the arguments made are actually similar to arguments that are made in all kinds of markets, right? So books seem very special, but seemingly similar arguments can be made about all kinds of products. So that's one point you discover. Another point you discover is that arguments that seem initially quite persuasive, quite sympathetic, seem a little bit less sympathetic if you push on them a little bit. I found, in thinking about all this, that sooner or later you reach a point at which arguments are being made that really are pretty hard. Like, there are no easy answers. There's no easy argument that just enforcing competition or demanding on capitalism or whatever is really the best way to go. But once you reach that point, you're at a point of arguments about whether we should have markets at all, whether we should have capitalism at all. And the questions that you're, I think, required to ask at that point aren't so much questions about whether you should have antitrust or not. It's very broad questions of social policy. So for example, seemingly very sensitive, important issue in a case like Amazon, and similar cases from the past several decades in which Walmart and Costco and so on have become powerful, have killed off. I mean, Main Street is largely gone, right? That's something I value from my own childhood in this small town Iowa in the 70s. That community is gone now. So how should we feel now? Well, you know, a problem is preventing that sort of thing, at least preventing individual business losses is, the more you think about it, not something that's very easy to defend. That is, if you believe in economics at all, if you believe in competition at all, businesses will fail sometimes. And indeed, sometimes they probably should. That's a deep argument that takes more time than we have, and we'll answer questions about it. But the more you think about it, that's an argument that is in my humble opinion, one of the relatively easy ones. The questions get a little bit harder the more you think about it. For example, in the Apple case, a real question was, what about protecting authors? What about ensuring that literature can be preserved in a world in which you have a very powerful seller insisting that their books be sold at very low prices? Again, it turns out that the more you think about it, the less persuasive that really is. The benefits, this is sort of a widely accepted commonplace amongst copyright scholars, the amount of reward that you have to give people to keep writing books turns out actually not to be that high. I write several books and I make peanuts on them. And we also happen to, you know, as a society, we subsidize the writing of books in lots of other ways. So that turns out to be not that persuasive. Moreover, the people who were selling that argument, the firms that said, we really need a cartel, we need a price-fixing conspiracy to fix a minimum price on books. To some extent it was authors, but it was mainly the publishing firms themselves who were defendants in the case. Those firms are 5 companies, each of which is a massive subsidiary of one of the conglomerates that largely controls media. All right, so moving on, and I'll close in just a minute or two. By the end, as I said, the more you think about something like this, you do eventually reach a point at which there are problems with having a competition policy that really are sort of problems of having capitalism that have no easy answers whatsoever, and surely they're not answered by just insisting on more competition or insisting on vigorous antitrust or anything else. And ultimately, I think the worst problems, and problems we're surely seeing with Amazon, the worst problems are sort of the human cost to labor, to communities, particularly to people who are the losers in transitions, right? Technology comes along, it's disruptive perhaps to a settled means of doing business. It poses substantial benefits in various ways to the broader community. I mean, ebooks, for example, pose some certain pretty dramatic benefits, not least being that they're very cheap to reproduce, very cheap to distribute. But there are a lot of losses associated with that transition, and that's just an example of many such transitions. And so how should we deal with that? I mean, my bottom line in the book is there aren't easy answers to these problems, but the answers that have some support in evidence, theory, and history are not restraining competition itself. It's let competition do what it does well, but protect the losers through other policies. Specifically, in my view, we need progressive tax policy. We need better welfare support system that we've got. We need social policies to protect the losers from this system. But the system itself probably is about the best thing we've got, except for all the others. That's where I come down on.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
I don't know if passing a microphone or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I?
They usually have 2 of them.
Okay.
They have 2. No,
There you go.
Okay. Thank you. I'm always impressed when the speaker doesn't use notes or anything with a computer. I really appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
Last night I went to a reunion and a young woman I know published her second book. And it's not available at Barnes & Noble, and it's not available at the library, and it's only available on Amazon. So she's had an opportunity to publish that she would not have had in traditional literary circles where someone comes out and says, yes, I think your book will make $1 million, sign here. And so I'm not an Amazon person or an Apple person in that sense, but I have to say that it's offered an opportunity for a great many people to be heard who would never have a voice in the old system.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like that. I don't know if that's necessarily good or bad that everybody can publish their book. I mean, there's an easy counter argument, which is it's actually kind of bad that everybody can publish their book because, among other things, now there's 1 million books and who knows what to read. Like traditional publishers surely perform sort of a screening role for us, right? Like it's a book on Viking, maybe it's worth reading, whatever. But that just raises an interesting question, I think, which is, are they really performing a function that justifies charging $20 more for a book than an ebook? I don't think so. And can markets figure out a different way to do that same thing? I think so. So yeah, I mean, I'm with you. It's hard. I think, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like over the course of the years, we've gone from having, hundreds of hoteliers to having 3 or 4 big hoteliers, and the same thing with hardware stores and grocery stores and medical clinics and hospitals. And it seems like no matter what area you're talking about, the move is towards conglomerates.
Yeah.
Where does this end?
Yeah.
I
That's
mean,
a good
do we
question.
all end up working for Bill Gates?
Yeah, I hope not. At least not university professors, so that's a good thing for me. I just realized, by the way, that this is a camera and I was standing directly in front of it for a second, so somebody saw up my nose. Yeah, good question. Where does it end? And my answer is, I'm sorry.
Is that on now?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
It's blinking red.
That's not good.
Okay, that's not good. I can talk loud, but do you need to record me?
It's okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
So I think absolutely, concentration is really big and scary right now. I think that our best approach to it is with traditional antitrust, except that we need sort of a reinvigorated antitrust. The rules we have are fine. There's a lot of debate now. It's in the papers all the time in a way that hasn't happened in decades, by the way. Antitrust has not been on the public mind in a long time. And everybody thinks that we need a new antitrust law. I kind of think we actually have a pretty good set of rules. We just actually need to enforce them. Our government hasn't enforced the antitrust laws meaningfully in about 40 years. So very vigorous merger policy and renewed, as antitrust lawyers would say, monopolization rule or unilateral conduct rule. Actually go after the big firms and their abuses. And I'd like to see what would happen if we actually litigated those cases for a while. I think maybe you had a...
Yeah, but the conversation's gone in a different direction.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
Looking at this from a different
Hold
point
it
of
to
view.
hold it to mouth.
Okay.
There you go.
Your talk, Dr. Sager, turned me to think of this in a different way in terms of if there is something called a moral, ethical development of the human creature. And I can see how there would have been a time when the stronger forces somehow observed the value of the lesser and could see that they should be preserved and protected. And then what I see today is the opposite of that the vulnerable forces should be consumed. And I'm wondering when this sense of ethical, moral brain development, if you want to call it that, or if it's even pertinent, has happened.
Yep. Yeah, so it's like, does vigorous capitalism and et cetera, does it have an inner moral argument that says the weak ought to fail?
Sherman antitrust was designed to protect.
Yeah, right. So the political origins of the law have been surely somewhat lost.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't particularly. I've been studying this for a long time. Like I said, I'm a lefty from way back. I don't want to see an antitrust law that sort of protects the small for its own sake, and that's amongst a lot of people that's not very welcome talk. The problem is there's a whole history of us trying to do that that turns out just like the argument of the publishers in Apple. It was easy to say for the publishers, we're here protecting the weak. We're here protecting the authors that are getting messed up by Amazon. Problem was, there's never been a cartel of distributors in history that organized themselves for the protection of their own suppliers. And they weren't there to protect authors or literature or the reading public. That's my view. So I'm with you in a big way. I mean, it's like Durkheim, famously said societies that drift into anomie, drift into loss of community, they suffer. They have increased rates of suicide, et cetera. It does feel like we've got that now in America, partly because of this, probably because of the cheerleading for capitalism. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have one particular antitrust, though, because I don't personally find it to be an antitrust problem.
That was an interesting comment making about the consolidation of the industries. And so one thing that I keep hearing about is, even though we're extremely low unemployment, we haven't seen wages take off. And I'm just wondering if this consolidation of these industries has essentially sort of like suppressed the need for offering wages to people. So that's one comment, or I can make a comment on that. The other thing is, I don't see how the young people are going to really make it unless they can be entrepreneurs, and I have no idea how they're going to sort of like enter a very intense marketplace when there's so much control by these big industries. So if you make a comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both things are serious concerns, and both are consequences of, like I said, about 40 years of very lax antitrust. Concentration grows. The people surely could debate empirically how much concentration amongst employers explains low wages, but it's hard for me to believe it's coincidental. We have a lot of concentration, we have real low wages. Well, that's because you have power buyers paying the wages. And it may also be because we have like a seriously demoralized labor policy, right? It's very hard to collectively bargain. Unions have lost a lot of their strength. But I kind of think, had we enforced the antitrust laws vigorously, strong merger policy, a lot more monopolization enforcement, we wouldn't have so much concentration, and there would be side effects. I think, for one thing, it'd be easier to start a small business if you want. Probably workers would do a little bit better if they had alternative employers to choose from. Maybe it would even help the sort of second order social benefits, like the moral values that seem to have been lost.
Many on the left have told me that the key to reversing what's going on in terms of the kind of consolidation that you've been talking about is simply a renewed effort to regulate corporations and banks. I have several concerns about that. One is that may have worked in the 50s and 60s when there was much more of a shared understanding between capital and labor about what was good for America. That consensus is gone. And I think that the issue is no longer what businesses to regulate, large businesses, because the regulators often come from the businesses themselves and have the corporate values that are sometimes the enemy of building a just society. I think what we need to do, especially when we talk about businesses that are too big to fail, if they're too big to fail, then they're too big to be privately owned. And I certainly feel that way about the banks, about healthcare, health insurance, and certainly big pharma. When you see the prices that they charge, why? To please their shareholders. What are your thoughts on moving from simple regulation to selective public ownership of some large businesses that in fact seem to be incapable of acting in the public interest?
Yeah, makes sense to me. And it seems like there's a couple of, so you can think of a couple of radical ideas. That would be radical from the perspective of our current political system, regime, whatever. That would be one. The government ought to just own these things. Another one would be, let's revert to an antitrust law like we haven't ever really had in this country, except with a couple of exceptions, and that is, let's just have a vigorous law that says you can only be so big, like a flat cap on firm size, or we can break you up for no reason except that you've gotten too big. So, in other words, sort of a no-fault monopolization. That's a kind of law we virtually have never had. It's very different from the law we've got right now. I'd kind of be happy with either kind of thing if it was politically plausible.
Ma Bell.
I'm sorry?
Ma Bell. They broke up Ma Bell because.
Oh, yeah, Ma Bell, which, you know, and the AT&T case, of course, is a chief emblem to a lot of people, though, of how badly antitrust has failed, because AT&T is like our biggest company again. So I don't exactly know what to say, except that in a perfect world, surely government ownership, say, of pharmaceuticals or health insurance or something would be better than what we've got right now. And it's going to be a tough road to hoe to fix those problems through antitrust. We got a lot of problems. I don't know what the right solution is, but yeah, I agree. Thanks.
I may be wrong about this, but I was wondering if the issue isn't sort of between horizontal and vertical integration. So if you have one problem with just taking businesses that are too big to fail and having the government control them is that it would seem to me that these would be businesses that are just simply less profitable. In fact, businesses that are already subject to competition, and this would simply allow an Amazon to sort of pick and choose, be more horizontally integrated, and capture the greater profits, whereas the government would be running these businesses basically as a nonprofit, not making any money. So then you would have these great corporations that are making 40 to 50% profit margins. I mean, because they'd be free from competition. That would be the problem.
Okay, so if we have a government control over pharma, for example, then there would be private companies that would be benefited by that? I'm not sure I followed that.
I mean, I feel like we already have considerable government control over pharma. Not necessarily, because we basically...
Yeah, not enough. I mean, the government could, it's an argument, I think a very good argument, perhaps, against the last comment, is that government has already mucked up pharma real bad, but mainly through patent policy, and the special rules that govern ownership of pharmaceuticals. I mean, that's a good point. Without getting too far into the weeds, I mean, a response to the nationalization argument is the same as the sort of traditional conservative argument against regulation, which is it just invites capture. It invites private companies to take control of government for their own benefit, and that was my reaction. I mean, the comment was, lefties were all saying, let's re-regulate these firms, but he doesn't think that would work, and he didn't really say why, but I think probably because it would be because of the same reasons that regulation has often been disappointing. It's been mainly an aid to monopolists to make more money, and that is emphatically the case in pharmaceuticals. And I guess I'm sympathetic to the nationalization argument, not because I think it's ever going to happen, or because I think it would really be the best choice, but just because what we've got has failed so badly, right? So probably some kind of radical medicine, if you will, is needed. What I want to see is, a generation or so of extremely vigorous antitrust, like we had in the 40s. We haven't had a real antitrust law in some decades. Break up a bunch of companies. Stop them from getting bigger through acquisition. Remember that vertical arrangements, as you say, can actually be extremely harmful to society. And see if that does some good. I think that, a good way of looking at competition is that we don't need to turn it into a religion the way that many do in this country. Like, markets aren't given to us by God. They're just things that actually do certain humble functions pretty well, and oftentimes better than government could do it. So I say, let's use competition for what it's good for, which we really haven't done. So I don't know if that answered your question at all. I didn't exactly get it.
No, I mean, there's a lot of questions here. As thinking of competition mainly as, something that works well for driving the price down to equilibrium. It works better for commodities, soybeans, corn, things where, there's not that much information needed, you have more perfect information.
Sure.
Fewer barriers to entry. As you say, all this intellectual property, everyone's saying, well, this is different, this is
Yeah.
books, this is copyright, this is
Sure.
trademark, trade secret, patent. You need to have these protections.
Yeah, and I think there's pretty good critiques of all the intellectual property arguments that are similar to arguments for antitrust. Intellectual property is basically one big argument that certain products are special, have to be protected from competition, but we've gone a little haywire in how much we protect them. Absolutely.
There's growing discussion about alternatives, economic alternatives that we can do more locally or statewide within a capitalist system that give alternatives. I'm thinking of, for example, the Democracy Collaborative and the Next System Project, which looks at publicly owned banks, worker-owned cooperatives, things that can be done locally to counter the effects of unregulated capitalism. And I wondered what you think about that. And I mean, here we have the example of the Evergreen cooperatives. That is a national example now. The other thing that I wonder about is that we've been talking about consolidation and the biggest corporations, but you also have the trend toward privatization of various aspects of our society that had been public. So we are losing the commons, we're losing control, even in areas like education where for-profit is taking over. And that's not an issue so much of size, but I don't know, of support for private enterprise doing what it wants.
Yeah, so I think two very good questions. Two very thoughtful questions. One is, could we have sort of local efforts to support businesses that operate in a way we like a little better? And second, what about privatization? Does the religion of capitalism explain that we should never have publicly provided functions? And I mean, the second one is easier for me because we've had a lot of privatization in the United States. Again, mainly in the last 40 years or so of the sort of significant turn to the right in American politics. The argument's been, well, government is a failure, Mark and Stu thinks better. And I could be easily mistaken for saying that I think that's good too. I think the real problem with privatization has been two things. One is when we allegedly privatize things, often we don't really do it very, very effectively. And that is, again, sort of a capture problem. The people arguing for privatization typically are the firms that are going to sell the products, right? So we have all these private prisons. I don't think the average American urged that. It was companies that wanted to profit from it. And they draft the bills, right? They draft the laws that are going to privatize these functions, and they have a golden opportunity to make it so that they won't face any meaningful competition. So that's problem number one. Like even if there are functions that it makes sense to privatize, we don't do it very well. It's like we don't really just let a market come to life. We monkey with it in all kinds of ways to keep competition from really happening. Second, there are plainly some products and services that are really problematic to leave to capitalism for reasons that we often don't think of. We never think of them in antitrust debate. So for one thing, there are values that are important social values that the participants in the market don't care about. So a private prison and its customer, which is the government, in some broad sense, they care about bad stuff like bribed judges sending people to keep beds filled and these awful things that we hear about in the news. But they don't internalize those decisions in their decision making. They the private prisons bid the lowest price they can, and then they do shenanigans thereafter. So plainly, there are some functions that really ought to be public ones because of values that we care about. A separate issue that, again, we never talk about in privatization debates is that we always talk about them as microeconomic problems, meaning we only think about the immediate effects in individual markets. Can we provide the same prison service for less money, right? But we don't think about the macroeconomic effects. So, for example, we've messed up, humbly, it seems to me, I'm not an education expert, but I have little kids in schools, and it's kind of a mess, right? Our education is a pretty serious mess, and there are spillover effects, I think. A population in which many people have poor education is not good for anybody economically. So even aside from the moral argument that we ought to just provide everybody an education, there's a very serious economic argument that I think that privatization proponents should take a lot more seriously. You know, if we're messing up the education of a whole bunch of the nationwide market for products and services, et cetera, we're going to have economic problems. So that's argument number one. Privatization is its own big issue. It seems really problematic. The other one is our local co-ops and so on. A good alternative. This is harder only because oftentimes it seems like those good ideas are difficult to keep going in practice. They're difficult to sustain. And you know, without perhaps some sort of public subsidy or public protection from competition, it's hard to see how they're really going to change things in a way that we care about. I wish I had a better answer on that. Unfortunately, it does seem that when government subsidizes things that seem like good ideas, that poses its own problems too. I'm not sure they're bad enough problems to mean that we shouldn't do it, but yeah, wish I had a better answer.
Well, in Europe, for example, various countries are supporting cooperatives.
Mm-hmm.
Barcelona's economy is 10% worker-owned cooperatives,
Mm-hmm.
and that's happening in Spain in a large way. Margarone.
Yeah. Yeah.
In my opinion, as long as the legislature is for sale to the biggest bidder, the only alternative is local power, which is very limited. So in my opinion, money dominates. The people that lead us are for sale. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, excellent question. Was that it? Okay, where do we go from here? Yeah, I mean, I think a very serious argument might be, I mean, I'm not an election law professor, so I'm not writing books about election law. Writing books about what I do, but a very serious question is maybe antitrust isn't the issue right now. It's fixing our government, and you know, it's a pretty discouraging problem. It's hard to see how any of the good ideas people have suggested are really going to meaningfully be a part of our public policy until our electoral system essentially is fixed. And it isn't just money. Money's a problem, but we also have gerrymandered House districts. We have, you know, lots of other problems. So probably ought to fix those problems first. Would have been great if I'm going live to the world with something I maybe shouldn't say so much in public, but would have been real great if we'd elected a Democrat, because there's a couple of changes on the Supreme Court that are probably going to happen that will frustrate meaningful campaign reform for a generation. So all the things we're talking about may be kind of secondary and a little bit, what am I going to do?
Yeah, you started down the path that I wanted to ask you about corporatism and the Citizens United and the whole ball of wax. But there was another one that's sort of an aside that I wanted to bring up. I wondered if you'd heard of the so-called Walmart effect. You talk about a level playing field for competition. And I used to do some work for a local company, Lubrizol, that supplied additives to the motor oil manufacturers like Pennzoil or Quaker State or whatever. And it turns out that when they supply to Walmart, they don't say, here's the price. Walmart tells them what the price is. And sometimes it's so low that their margin is almost non-existent. They make almost no money on that. Because Walmart is so big that they actually tell the supplier what the price is going to be. And in order to stay in business, then they have to raise the price to all the little guys. So the playing field is not even close to level in that regard.
Yeah, I get that. Couple responses. One is to maybe maintain a little bit of healthy skepticism of what the sales guys tell you at any particular firm. Because there's rarely, unless a person really is a monopolist, do they feel like they have the power to, right? They always feel like they're getting a shaft. That in and of itself isn't a great, in my opinion, the greatest reason to believe that Walmart has power to tell people what they can do. It does seem like retail has generated a lot of market share, enough market share to extort some of the margin from their suppliers, and I think that's the name of the game in retail right now. The way to make money in retail is to charge very low prices, get a big market share, and then squeeze the margin out of your suppliers. That's surely the case with Amazon, and plainly it was the case with Walmart and the dollar stores. It nevertheless raises the problem of what we should do. Traditional antitrust does have an answer. If firms get that kind of power, and they've done it through nefarious means, like they've done nasty things to squeeze out their own competitors so that they get some power of their suppliers, that can be the basis of an antitrust challenge, and we need to see more of that. I think, in some sense, like me talking about the Apple case and saying the publishers, it's fine, they did break the law and they should have been charged. That may sound like sort of a defense of Amazon, but I'm definitely not here to defend Amazon. I think they're a dangerous firm that needs to be subject to government oversight. And the way to oversee a firm like Amazon is to look at that conduct. Like, look at the conduct over the years they've used to get big market share, to squeeze people out of various markets. And when there's a case, sue them. So to me, the case, the issue in Apple wasn't should we sue the publishers or should we sue Amazon, which is how a lot of people saw it. I say the answer is sue them both if there's a case. With Amazon, there's going to be a case. I predict a major monopolization case against Amazon in the next 5 years or so.
I wonder what you think about the move to amend. That is to end corporate personhood, the fact that corporations have been given our Bill of Rights. Sure. So in the case of Citizens United, they have our free speech rights, and also the problem is that speech was created as money by the Supreme Court in '76. So they have too much power, and that's one of the reasons for a long time. In fact, it's like 125 years. It just didn't start with Citizens United. It started in 1886. So what do you think about that possibility?
Yeah, sure. Outside of my expertise by a fair ways, in principle, I absolutely share your instinct. Like, Citizens United seems pretty bad to me. Bank of Bilotti from the 70s seems pretty bad. Speech should not be equated with money. In my personal view, it would be a better society if speech were a right for human individuals. I guess what I've heard from people who know a lot more about it than I do is if there's a problem with the movement, it's in the unforeseen repercussions. I think one of the major concerns is how it might affect the press, which exercises again, I'm not the guy to make this case.
The press is protected.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what the courts say once the Constitution's amended. Like, a lot of ideas turn out to go really badly, unfortunately, once the courts get their hands on them. So I think that's the concern. In principle, taking away corporate speech, I agree with utterly. And by the way, people aren't really talking about it yet. People didn't talk about it during the 2016 election or the 2016 presidential primary. But one of the biggest things I fear that's come along in American history in a long time was that election and the justices that president would pick. And we've got a guy who looks like he's probably going to be confirmed, who has made clear in his dissents that he thinks not only should corporations have rights, but rights are primarily associational. We have constitutional rights primarily to protect people's ability to make money and use their property. So we've taken a really bad turn, and maybe that's one more reason that we really need an amendment. Although, you know, an amendment at a time when that's the court that will interpret whatever we amend could be really problematic. I don't know.
We're going to have to wrap it up, but since I was the one who.
We have about 15 more minutes.
Okay, well, then I'll use my
Still have
prerogative.
some more.
I'm the one who dragged you here, so let me ask you a question regarding politics. It's striking that all of these companies, that Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, based on the West Coast, solidly blue states, the very wealthiest people in the country and the wealthiest districts vote Democratic. Personally, they're just not acting this way. I got onto this because I realized I've contributed to some books as you, and I've made no money on it, but I don't expect to. I don't make a living doing it. But people who do make a living had to go through Amazon. It was amazing when I heard this interview on NPR some years ago. Well, I can't get anything published until I go through Amazon. And Amazon, personally, I'm convinced they had the power to resuscitate an area that needed to, save Detroit. If they moved 50,000 well-paying jobs to Detroit, they could have saved that city. And I'm convinced they're going to move to Washington, D.C., the last city in the country that needed 50,000 high-paying jobs, because they want to lobby, they own the world. Bezos owns a house. On the other hand, he owns the Washington Post, a liberal paper. Where does politics come into all this? The very wealthiest people now are Democrats. Where's it going to play out? Amazon's going to be in a position to lobby the government in ways that we've never seen before.
Yeah, not exactly sure I understand the question,
Well,
but what
let's say-
significance
let's
does
say
it
that-
have that all this money has found its way into the hands of Democrats?
And
That-
let's
doesn't
say
seem
for
like a
the sake
good
of
thing.
argument, that they move a campus to half Maryland, half Virginia, straddle the Potomac River, with the intent they already control 50% of retail. They want to use their power to impact the government. On the other hand, it seems to be the Republicans who've weaponized Twitter and Facebook to win elections. So where's this going to play out in terms of politics?
Well,
and the
yeah, I mean,
future of
so
our government?
so the tech companies of various kinds, they lobby a lot, right? Obviously, and they lobby on competition issues. So they flex their muscles really extensively on competition issues. They inevitably do it in ways that benefit their own particular business, and their particular business might be benefited by more antitrust in a given area or less antitrust. So, or in various other issues, right? Like firms can use privacy, popular fears of privacy protection against their competitors if they don't happen to be the firms that are particularly of concern in privacy. Google, Amazon, and the other platform firms that sell stuff on a platform, they have a particular interest in certain kinds of things being illegal, but not other kinds of things. And so they urge that those things should be illegal, whereas their competitors then will argue that other things should be illegal. So in other words, the money in their hands, it seems to me, it doesn't really matter that they're Democrats or not, at least as far as lobbying concerning competition policy goes. They serve their businesses' own interests regardless of what their own party is. So, I mean, I think that by and large, the Silicon Valley folks who have lots of money, they do, from my understanding, they do lean heavily left, but that really is only significant in non-commercial affairs, right? They're very left on social issues, but not economic regulatory ones.
Could you explain
Sure.
how antitrust suits are initiated? What branch of
Sure.
government deals
Yes,
with
absolutely.
that?
Okay, so antitrust is primarily the Sherman Antitrust Act,
Yeah.
which says, with an important amendment, it says basically three things are illegal. You can't conspire with your competitors. You can't acquire a monopoly and use it to squeeze out your competitors, and you can't acquire your competitors to give yourself a monopoly. And the way that those three rules are enforced is two things. Well, really three things. The federal government can sue anybody that it thinks is violating the antitrust laws. The state attorneys general can also do that, and then private people who've been hurt by something can sue somebody that's, yeah.
But if the government initiates it,
Mhm.
what body of government would do that?
Yeah, so the Justice Department has a bureau that enforces the
Okay,
antitrust laws. We also have an independent agency called the Federal Trade Commission that does the same thing. They enforce exactly the same laws. It's just kind of a historical accident that we have two agencies doing it.
thank you.
You're welcome. And then it's for the courts, by the way. I mean, they can't bring a case unless they can win in court, which is part of the problem. We've had a lot of very conservative appointments to the federal courts over the last several years, and it makes it really hard to enforce antitrust. And it's going to be hard for a while. Yes?
One of the things that is so overwhelming at times, when you look at the markets and antitrust and so forth, is everything being online, the social media, the instant gratification, how advertising has changed, and an individual trying to make their way through all of this, and other than trying their best to buy locally with what resources they have, I don't know that there's any other answer, but is there a message, if you could come up with a message that would kind of promote your thinking about antitrust and small business and so forth, what would that one message be if it were to be used, for example, on social media?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I'm pretty good at writing copy, but I do it slowly, so I don't know exactly how to answer that.
Just to raise the awareness.
It'd be something, yeah, it'd be something like Antitrust 2018. Markets are good, but they're not a religion. So I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, the problem is I think that like I said, my basic theme in my book and the basic theme I tried to say here is we accept markets in the abstract. We sort of like competition in the abstract. None of us ever really likes it when we take a look at a specific case. And that's a little hard to boil that down to some sexy slogan that you could sell on the internet.
Raise the awareness of
But yeah, I mean the basic problem is
awareness.
markets are good left and right. Yeah.
And one other comment is, I'm thinking of an example of where the federal government subsidizes Amazon, and that's, the example of U.S. Postal Service.
Oh, yeah.
So, Amazon figured out it's too expensive to do home-to-home delivery, so they're just gonna use the existing network and whatever, and so the government, subsidizes a losing operation, U.S. Postal Service, and Amazon takes full advantage of it, and it adds to their monopoly. That's one thing. And the other thing is, and they use sort of Uber style for delivery for their Amazon Prime, and it knocks out FedEx's and UPS and so on and so forth, and other things that, where there's actually labor rules.
Sure, and it exploits extremely low income, powerless people to do the delivery. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm under the impression that the post office makes money off Amazon.
It's hard to say. I mean, there's a huge amount of politics surrounding Amazon, as you said, surrounding Amazon and Postal right now, and it's complicated. The Postal Service itself is not very happy with Amazon because it squeezes them just like it squeezes all its other suppliers. I do think it's still the case that the post office covers its costs through postage. We don't actually subsidize our post office as taxpayers. We do it through postage. So I think they're still doing okay, but that doesn't mean it's not a serious concern. And as you say, arguably we're helping Amazon against its own competitors, right? With substantially lower rates. I think it calls for a little bit of caution in saying that the government is losing money on Amazon and therefore subsidizing its competitors, because it turns out, Amazon's been around since '94. And I can't do math on the fly, but I think that's like 25 years. And one of the biggest stories about Amazon is people say it never makes any money, it never makes profit. It's actually quite misleading. They made a lot of money, huge amounts of money. They reinvest it. But the point of this is that whole time, the 25 years, essentially all of Amazon's suppliers of products that it then resells, they all say that Amazon is selling at a loss. It's selling those products at a loss as part of a monopolization scheme. If you think it through, that just isn't plausible. A firm can't persist that long and never actually make any money, lose actual wholesale losses on every product. So that probably just isn't quite the story. They really have contributed a lot of significant stuff in terms of, for example, logistical innovations. Like they figured out how to make retail cheaper. And you know, one of the things that bothers me about talking about this is I always find myself talking like Robert Borg. And this is kind of a Borky argument. It's like, this is sort of like monopolies are good for society, which I don't think at all. But one thing that is pretty good for society, particularly a society that is, you know, rapidly expanding in population, has way outgrown its own ecosystem. Like without technological innovations of all kinds, we're in real trouble. And this really is the engine of sort of logistical innovation that we're not going to be able to live without. So I guess I just feel like it calls for some caution.
Last question?
Do you see, do you think we'll see much of mega companies going toe-to-toe against each other? Just to give an example, in recent times, Disney, huge mega company, has not made it possible for Amazon to offer their blockbuster movies in pre-orders at prices that equal what the Targets and the Best Buys do. And Amazon will offer these movies at twice the price, for instance, of some of these other smaller competitors of theirs, until, maybe a month after the product has been released, when many of the sales have already taken place. And so do you see much evidence of that sort of one mega company against another mega company?
I don't know that story specifically, and I don't know specific stories about Amazon, but that sort of thing is an old story in capitalism. And it can feel sort of like competition, like maybe this is our best alternative. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out very well for you and me. Like when they fight with each other, it's just a fight over which one of them gets more of the stuff they take out of our wallet. Yeah. And right now, as was said earlier, we got concentration all over the place, unfortunately, right now, or so it seems. And so we're going to increasingly see what economists call bilateral monopoly. We're going to see lots of cases in which the real action in a given market is one monopolist producer of a good is fighting with a monopolist retailer of the good, and there isn't any really very meaningful competition going on. The two of them are just fighting over who gets the most margin.
Right.
So, and by the way, that they tell lots of stories. In those situations, the firms at one or the other level will very frequently argue that they are in fact the victims of monopoly, and therefore they need government assistance, or they need the freedom to band together as a group, as if they're really just a labor union or something. So newspapers want to bargain collectively with Facebook over ad rates, doctors want to bargain collectively with health insurers, etc. A lot of those cases can seem really sympathetic, but very often it's really just one monopolist fighting with another.
Professor Sagers, thank you very much. That was outstanding.
Thanks very much.
And I have a few announcements to make here this morning. First of all, our community forum next Sunday is drinking water and sewage runoff. What's the connection? And it has to do with over 1.3 million people being served by the Cleveland Water Department, and the resulting kind of situation we've had with sewage discharge into Lake Erie, and the settlement that required 98% of the runoff to be tested and monitored and so forth by the EPA. Long story short, the speakers will be Mark Lefkowitz. He's the interim director of Green City Blue Lake Institute, an environmental organization. The panelists will be Matt Sharver, director of the watershed programs for Northeast Ohio, and the Cleveland Water Commissioner, Alex Margificius. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. It will be a very interesting panel from different points of view being expressed. So we want to welcome all of you to that, and to the upstairs sermon, which will be about what an individual has learned from coaching Little League. So we do have a diversity of topics here. And I want to make sure that everyone has a copy of our upcoming forums in this orange brochure. So they're available right there on the coffee table. So please help yourself and share them with others. We want to spread the word about these kinds of conversations that we've had, of which this morning was an example. Thank you very much.
We should set up our lunch meeting so we can also talk about our Sanibel. Yeah, so give your